Okay, so question number 9. Alright, so here we're asked, how do you factor x squared plus 4? So x squared plus 4. Let me flip the page. So right away we can kind of just looking at this, we can see that 4 is obviously square root of 4 is 2. So we can recognize that right away. But if we want to factor this, so we want to get it to a situation where we have x plus or minus some term, and then multiply by x plus or minus some term. Right? So we have kind of two components here, and we want to just factor that out. When you look at this, you can't really say that it's x squared, you know, if you want to just solve for x, so let's say you have x squared plus 4 is equal to 0. You want to solve for x squared is equal to negative 4. And then here we can see that if we're trying to solve for x, we have to square root a negative number. If we square root both sides of the equation, you can see that x is equal to plus or minus square root of negative 4. And that's really the main idea here for this question, is that we're square rooting a negative number. So let's quickly go through the junior tutor's answer, and then we'll come back to this. So the expression cannot be factored using a real number coefficient. So we can't do this with real numbers, we need imaginary numbers, or complex numbers. So we can factor this using complex numbers. So they start off saying negative 4 is equal to 2i squared. Okay, so what is this I here? So I'll erase this down here. I'll erase this as well. I'll write this a little smaller as well. So x squared plus 4 is what we're looking at. So let's define what I is. I is just the square root of negative 1. So you don't have to really write square root of negative 1, but whenever you see I, it means square root of negative 1. So when you see, let's say I squared, what does that mean? So you can kind of look at this expression. If you square both sides of the equation, you can see that the square root is gone. We just get rid of it. And we end up with just I squared is equal to negative 1. So that's important to know for this question. That's how we kind of go about getting to this result. So knowing this, let's say we set this to 0, we have x squared equals negative 4. So we move the positive 4 to the other side. We end up with x is equal to square root of negative 4, plus or minus. So we can see that we had the negative. We know the square root of 4 is 2. So we can say it's plus or minus 2. Bring that out to the front of the square root. We still have the negative 1 in the under the square root bracket. So knowing this, we know this right here. So we can just substitute that in. So we know it's plus or minus 2i. That's what x equals. So that's kind of how we get to this point. So essentially they're just defining here that negative 4 is 2i squared. But when you look at this, you can just think, okay, I is square root negative 1. 2 squared is 4. Square root negative 1 is negative 1. So I'll just write that down here. 2i squared. So 2 squared is 4. Square root of negative 1 squared is just times negative 1. And you end up with negative 4. That's why they're claiming this expression. So looking at this below, they say x squared plus 4 is also equivalent to x squared minus negative 4. And looking at this now, we can clearly see that this is a difference of squares, because the negative 4 can represent it as this, and we can see that these two are a difference of squares. So erasing this, we know that the difference of two squares is just anything that's in this format. So a squared minus b squared. So a here is x, b here is 2i. And we end up with this expression. Similarly, what we did over here, we kind of did the same, a different process to get to the same root. So we know x is plus or minus 2i, and that's the case over here. But we know that x squared plus 4 is a difference of squares based on this right here. and we end up with x plus 2i, x minus 2i. And this is the correct answer. So we'll mark this question as correct. So correct answer, great job. But yeah, just to summarize the main idea here, the main thing that you really need to know for this question is this right here. So knowing this, we can use this below. We know that square root of -1 is I. We can represent -4 as 2i squared, and since we can represent it in this way, we can kind of do some manipulation, algebra, changing operations, and end up with x squared minus 2i squared. And then this is a simpler format for us to look at. Okay, we recognize the difference of two squares. We know the general expression down here is a squared minus b squared is a plus b times a minus b. So there's another important formula to know. So just this right here. So different squares you can factor out like that. And that kind of simplifies things a little further. And we'll mark this as correct and move on to question number 10.